Welcome, and thanks you to everyone out there who's joining us today for this discussion on running efficient, effective, and engaging retrospectives. This is a lead dev webinar, and we're really happy to be here with you today. Some housekeeping notes: this webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists here will head over to the lead dev Slack to answer any of your questions that you have in the #retros channel. So if you haven't joined the lead dev Slack, I highly recommend you check that out. It's a great resource, both for the duration of this panel and for getting great tips on all things lead dev related later on. Well, I'm hoping that we get through this in a snappy fashion, so we have some time to take some questions live. So there is a Q&A module at the bottom. So as we're speaking, if you have any questions for the panelists or myself, please go ahead and use that Q&A module, and we'll try to get to that at the end of this presentation. So let's get started off with some quick introductions. I am Jessie Link. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the VP of Engineering Team Development at Twitter. Now, I've had the pleasure of speaking at a previous live lead dev conference about this topic of retrospectives. So I'm incredibly flattered that they asked me to help moderate our discussion for this afternoon. And I am joined with 4 amazing panelists here today. So I'm going to have each one of them introduce themselves briefly to us. So let's start with you, Ceci.
Hello, my name is Ceci Correa, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm a backend developer at Shopify, where I work on app extensibility, and I also presented at the Lead Dev Austin in 2018 on this very subject, mostly focusing on different formats for retros.
Wonderful. Well, thanks for being here with us today. And next up is Nick.
Hi there. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm Nick Stenning. I'm an engineering manager at Microsoft, where I've been for the last couple of years. Where I work with a site reliability engineering team trying to keep the Azure cloud up and running. And I also have been a lead dev speaker at 2019, I'm losing track of time, 2019 in Berlin, talking about post-incident review and how we learn from incidents.
Okay. Well, what even is time anymore? But we can't blame you on that one, Nick. It's been quite a year, y'all. So but thanks for being with us, Nick. And next up is Fabian.
Hey everyone, I'm Fabian and my pronouns are he, him. I work as an engineering manager at Babel, and I serve teams that help our users build a healthy learning habit. We want them to dedicate small chunks of their time regularly to learn a new language. I haven't talked at LeadTab yet. I stumbled into this room just by accident, I guess.
We like to keep things, exciting, keep the other panelists on our toes. So welcome, Fabian, to your first official lead dev presentation.
My pronouns are also, my pronouns are he, him, by the way. I forgot to say that.
Oh, great. Oh, thank you, Nick. Very good. And then finally joining us is Bruno.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. I too am new to lead dev, but I'm excited for this panel. I serve as the SVP of engineering at Doximity. We build tools for doctors, and I've been building software since I can remember. Excited to talk about the topic of retrospectives, and my pronouns are also he, him. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, well, we've got an amazing lineup for you all, and I want to get right into it and hear from each one of you about how you think about retrospectives, what tips you have for our audience. So hopefully this will be a lively 45 minutes to an hour as a group together. So obviously retrospectives are an incredible tool to have in your toolkit. They're one of my favorite tools to actually use as a manager when I'm leading teams. And in many ways, it's not just a singular tool. It's not just a hammer, right? It's in many ways a multi-tool or a Swiss Army knife, and that retrospectives can be deployed in a lot of really interesting ways to give you insights into what's going well with your team, what isn't going well with your team. They work at sort of the much more tactical short span level if you want to do them at the sprint level for 2-week or 1-week intervals, but they can also be really powerfully employed to do a much larger look back, over a month or even a quarter or a year, depending on how you want to employ them. And so I think what we really want to do today is kind of explore that wide range of types of retrospectives, things to think about when you're utilizing them, and all of that great stuff. So let's start with why you would do a retrospective. So this is a question for all the panelists, and we'll start with Fabian on this one. So can you give an example of one of the instances in which you would reach into your toolkit and use a retro? How have you employed retros before?
Yeah, absolutely. So I really feel that regularly self-reflecting on how you work as a team is one of the core agile software development practices, and I really like to adhere to it. I feel if you take the time to pause and reflect, you can continuously improve not just the product that you build, but how you build it as a team. And I prefer to do them really at a regular interval, not just at the end of a project. You can do that, you will learn for the next project, but every project is somewhat different. So I really like to do them multiple times throughout a project so that you can adjust your course as you go.
Wonderful. Thanks, Fabian. And next up, we'll ask Bruno. Bruno, what are some instances where you find retros really impactful to use with your team?
Yeah, so I would agree with everything Fabian said, but I also found them interesting at times where the team has grown and potentially split into sub-teams, where leadership has shifted within the teams, where folks have shifted between teams that have either grown too large and split into more functional-based teams. I found that those are really good at surfacing the otherwise unknown and unknowable issues that would come up that are not necessarily related to a project in particular, but more related to how people interact with each other. So that would be a good example. We also like to do them at the end of large projects, and it seems obvious, but sometimes you can go and notice that you're working on a very large project and you finally finish it, and then you think, okay, I'm done. But that's the best time to retrospect because you have all that built up momentum and all that built up feedback to share. So we find that we collect a lot of really insightful information that helps us prepare for the next project that way. So those would be my the two call outs that I like to mention here.
That's great. And that's a really terrific point you make, because again, I think you can get really, if you're doing them on a regular basis, congrats, good for you. But I think you can get so used to them being this tactical every 2-week look back that you forget that, again, they can be used to take a much broader view of what's going on there. So that's a terrific example. We'll move on to Ceci next.
Sure. I definitely want to echo what has already been said. Definitely a good cadence is good. Obviously, I think the best types of retros is when you don't need a retro because you are keeping up with your team's needs and what they're doing. But I also agree with Bruno that a great time to use retros that you often don't see it is when you do start a new team. So I've been in instances where I'm onboarded onto a new team, and as part of that onboarding process, you have a retro where you're kind of being welcomed into the team. Obviously that sometimes it's not very scalable if you have large teams, but I can definitely see again, where if there are changes within that team structure, a type of like retro like that can be really helpful. I've been in situations where as part of that process, we have a retro mostly where we touch upon the team OS. What does this team do? And how do they operate, and what are some things that you're bringing to the table? Let's talk about that and how that can also mesh with how we are currently doing things.
That's great. I love it as a start, not an ending, right? You're starting a new team. You're starting something with a team. That's a really great perspective. I think the word retro is like a little deceptive because it makes it look like it's only going in one direction. It can actually be used to look forward, which I think is one of the most fascinating things about retrospectives. Wonderful. And then last but not least, Nick.
Yeah, I love Ceci's concept of a team OS, and that jibes really nicely with how I think of retros and the role that they play in the teams that I work with, which is I try and build a kind of a way of working in a team where changing stuff is relatively cheap to do, and we always see change as kind of an experiment, right? And for me personally, this comes from kind of the like lean improvement cycle from W. Edwards Deming, the like plan, do, check, act, or plan, do, study, act cycle. The retro is kind of for me and for my teams, the study part of this. And so particularly when you have a new team, or particularly when things are changing around you, context or people on your team, like your parts of your team OS have now changed. That's a great time to get into a habit of doing retrospectives. I will also just briefly shout out that Fabian and Bruno, I really enjoy the like longer look back retrospectives as well.
Okay, awesome. Wonderful. Yeah. And like, again, there's just so many great ways to use these. And I like, I like what we said about how, it's not just about when things are going terribly wrong. I think one of the most fascinating ways I like to use the retro is for the team to reflect on ways that they can go from good to great, right? To do that kind of transformation and to really optimize their performance, not just about what's holding us back, or sort of fixing things that are terribly wrong. It's what changes can we make to proactively start going in the right direction. So I really love that concept. So what a wonderful intro to this topic. So let's pick on a few more specific points here. Now, I want to acknowledge that we're all doing this remotely. And we're all dialed in today. So that's the reality for everyone. But for a lot of us, that was kind of the reality anyway. Right? If you're on a global engineering team, chances are you may have had a remote teammate anyway prior to this sort of crisis. And so, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about making retrospectives accessible and fun to do for remote-based teams. Because obviously when you first learn about retros, it has a very in-person flavor to it, right? Like you learn about putting physical sticky notes on a whiteboard somewhere. And while those are certainly fun, it's not the reality for a lot of development teams, certainly before COVID and certainly after COVID. So Bruno, let's start with you. What are some ways you think about, you've adapted the way you think about retros in a remote world?
Yeah, so we run actually I'm really looking forward to hearing from Cece on this one, because after having seen her talk, I think she has a lot of unique, novel, and useful ideas for running this. I don't have a ton of those, but we do run a relatively large engineering team that is distributed, and we've experimented with a lot of different ways of doing it remotely. Um, the most difficult part that we found is that it's getting feedback from the quiet ones, right? It's giving the space, it's opening the floor in some way, shape or form, so that the folks who don't typically voice their opinions in person now have the opportunity to do so in a remote medium. That's one point. I think the other point that we've tried to address for is the ability to break out into small rooms with a focused topic. So what we do is we solicit, what are the most important topics that we want to cover in this retrospective, preemptively, async. We use stickies.io to do that. And then we go into breakout rooms, and that room is filled with people who are interested about that topic, who are passionate, who want to ask questions about that topic. And then that room walks away with essentially a slide of what we talked about, what we want to do, what do we want to see next, what problems do we want to solve. So that's how we sort of bridge the gap of getting people to be able to feel comfortable voicing their opinions, and also walking away with a very a very concise next set of next steps for what we want to do with that. But I will pass it over to Cece because I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say.
Great.
Sure. So from my perspective, what I have seen work in the teams that I've worked with is giving your team ownership to truly own the retro. So if they want to change formats, it is up to the team to do so, allowing different people from the team to lead retro. If your team is of a size where you can very easily sort of rotate through your whole team, and allowing each one person to own a retro and set the pace for that retro, I think that increased ownership really helps people be more engaged, regardless of the fact that we're all working remotely. Another thing that I have found that really works is letting people know that you don't have to wait until retro time to start thinking about things to talk about during retro, because what happens often is that the discussion ends up being about what just happened. So if you're doing a 2 weeks cadence at the end of your sprint, the conversation is probably going to be very likely about what just happened at the end of the sprint, and you end up forgetting about things that happened mid-sprint. So one of the things that we started doing is using Slack reminders, and we would send out a Google Doc where people could mid-sprint start writing things that they wanted to talk about at the next retro. Then that way you're getting a reminder mid-sprint, hey, I need to think about things to talk about. And I think that really helps keep people more engaged and keep people thinking more about those things that they might want to bring up, but might otherwise get dropped. I think it might be very easy to just take a couple minutes, jot down a couple bullet points, again, kind of mid-sprint, and then sort of revisit that. But one other thing that I want to touch on how to keep remote retrospectives engaging for remote teams is that right now we're in COVID and we were all kind of forced into all sharing the same experience. So we are all at home in a home office. We all have a webcam and we're all kind of at that same even playing field. But I've been working remotely since 2014 on and off. I've done hybrid teams where one team is in an office and I'm all alone at home, or I'm in an office and the other team is in another office. Like I've done it all. And the biggest thing that I want to say is that as things start to open back up and the dynamic changes again, don't forget how hard it can be to have one team be in a conference room and putting stuff down on a whiteboard and you're in a laptop and you can't really see what they're writing. It's really hard for you to hear what they're saying. Don't forget that just because we're going back, hopefully as soon as it's safe to do so, don't forget about that. Keep everything in an even playing field as you move forward.
That's a wonderful point. And I think what I heard you both really talk about were some of the unexpected benefits of remote, right? The idea that, again, you can put your inputs in asynchronously. So it's really important, again, as we move back to this culture where we will return to offices, if all goes well soon, that you remind yourself that being remote wasn't 100% an inconvenience, that there are some net benefits. I love the idea of just jotting, don't wait for the retro, jot it down now. I think feedback is like sushi. It's better when it's fresh. Right. So you really want to encourage folks to sort of capture that. And again, I think when you're built for remote first, right, and you keep your retros designed that way, you have those mechanisms by which you can capture that feedback in the moment, right? Like if I had to put it on a physical sticky and then hold on to that sticky for a week, I would never have inputs, right? My stickies would be gone with the wind in the first day. So I think that's the thing to really think about with your teams is, hey, what's really going well about this format that we do want to preserve, as we return to more co-located possibilities. So that's really terrific. Nick, I want to toss to you real quick, because you had a bit of a story when we were preparing for this panel about your team changing the way they thought about retros and being remote friendly because of COVID specifically. So I wonder if you wanted to share some of that with us.
Yeah, I mean, I'll preface this by saying I don't have any particularly deep insights or any answers, but I think you and Ceci both just mentioned that like having everybody move to remote has changed things, and some of those changes have been good. They put everybody on a level playing field for the first time in a long time for those of us who work in hybrid teams. But there's a flip side to that, which is a lot of people are now on video calls for many hours of the day. And that can be really emotionally exhausting in a way that in-person communication isn't, or isn't always. Can certainly still be for some people. And it poses new challenges. And so like I have been thinking a lot about this recently, where there is a lot going on, or has been a lot going on over the last year, that is different and difficult in ways that we need to talk about and we need to address, which says we should do a retro, or we should have some forum for having those conversations. But at the same time, right now, a retro is another meeting. Like it's another time when you're asking people to come and bring their energy and their emotional engagement to a topic that maybe they don't have the space for right now. So balancing those is difficult. And I think the one insight that I think I do have, which is very much riffing off advice that Lara Hogan has given me and others in the past, is when things get difficult for people, as a facilitator, you can help them out by providing slightly more constrained options for discussion. So, right, like you don't want to, as a facilitator, when somebody says XYZ is a problem, you never want to come along and say, here's the solution to your problem. That's not your job as a facilitator, right? At the other end of the spectrum, there's the like fully open-ended questions. What does the room think of that? Does anybody have any idea? Maybe when people are a little bit more strained, your role as a facilitator has to come some way along that spectrum to saying, so I can think of a couple of options that we could choose for dealing with this. Here's option one, here's option two, here's option three. Who thinks that, who has opinions on which of those options might be good? So just removing some of the emotional burden of participating in the retro and taking like one or two steps along that spectrum to support the team and not have to have them do all of the work.
Right, that's a great point. And it kind of segues nicely into our next discussion topic here, because really, retros, they should be something that the team sees value in and gets value out of, right? And hopefully on some level they're fun or they serve some kind of, their emotional release. Fabian, you wrote an amazing blog post where you talk about retrospective fatigue. And again, that was certainly true pre-COVID. And to Nick's amazing point there, it's more important than ever in current COVID times that we really monitor for these like signs of retro fatigue. So, what are some ways that you think about keeping retros fresh and engaging so that when we ask that of our teams, that they're enjoying themselves, that they're keeping it interesting for them so that it feels like a positive engagement?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think very popular questions in a retro are what went well, what didn't go so well, and those are valid questions to ask in a retro, but they can get dull over time. So what we tried is breaking out of that monotony and introduce variety to our retros. And in fact, like now every retro in our teams has a different theme. So for example, I did a retro for the first multifunctional team at Babel a few years back, and it had a circus theme. So I asked the participants to imagine our last sprint was a circus performance, and they were artists in that circus. And people were great. They came up with so creative ideas, right? Some described their experience as they felt like jugglers because they had to do so much multitasking, or others said they felt like lion tamers because they had to deal with threats to the project. I then continued to ask them to write internet reviews of that circus performance and give like a 5-star rating to it. And we discussed the reviews and asked ourselves, okay, let's brainstorm ideas how we can get that 3-star rating to a 5-star rating. And that were the actions that we took from that retro. In other retros, we sailed across the seas, we fought zombies, we went to an amusement park. Like you get the gist. I really tried to make them fun at work. And this transported also well into the now remote setup. It is even more exhausting maybe for the facilitator, but the teams really appreciate like getting out of the monotony and breaking out of the usual cycle of things.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And you touch on a couple of things there, like the power of metaphor and the power of play, right? To help us mine and get comfortable with each other and really find these deep truths within that framework of play or funny metaphors and things like that. So I really love those ideas. I got to get your tips on the zombie retro. So I'll chase you on that one. Ceci, you also in your talk talked about doing a retro of your retros and examining what's working well for your team, what isn't. So I wanted to toss the question to you as well.
Yeah, so that experiment of the retro of retros came from this team, again, where we were very big on our team OS to the point where we had written everything down, everything was codified. And as part of our ongoing sort of upkeep of our team OS, we went through this idea of the retro of retros. And this is where different members from the team would lead retro and they would pick what format they wanted. So for example, if you're looking for different formats to try, you can go to funretrospectives.com and check out different types of formats you can try. There's also retromat.org, and that also has some other ideas. So some of the things that we tried was the 3 Little Pigs. Some people might be familiar with that, where you have a house of sticks, house of straw, house of bricks, and you put things into those categories. What is built like a house of sticks, kind of flimsy? What are things that are that we have that were built like a house of straw, kind of okay, but a little flimsy? And what are things that we built that are a house of brick? It never fails. It's really resilient. So it's still, once again, kind of those 3 buckets, but it gets you to think outside of the same what worked, what didn't. Another one that I think a lot of people might have heard of before is the hot air balloon exercise. I personally really like that one because I think it gets you to think more in these big sky, no pun intended, type of thought, where you and your team are in a hot air balloon and you are trying to get to some nice weather over here. The nice weather can be a rewrite of our API, or whatever you're trying to drive towards. It might not necessarily be the sprint, maybe it's at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year. So more like big sky types of ideas. And then you have some bad weather that you want to avoid. And that can be, I don't know, tech debt, whatever, maybe some pitfalls that you really want to avoid falling into. And so the hot air balloon exercise, it's about how do you get to your desired state? How do you avoid this like unwanted state? And what are the things that are propelling you towards the good weather? So that would be the hot air. This metaphor is a little flawed, admittedly, because a lot of people use the sandbags as the anchors that are holding you down, but the sandbags are good. So sometimes those formats can be a little tricky. But yeah, I think allowing your team to sort of have that ownership and be free enough to say, hey, I want to try this new format. I think that's what really helps keep things kind of fresh. And it doesn't have to be a completely new format. Like, for example, there's some formats that are not even about the work. It can be something like, let's give out Academy Awards to the stories in our sprint. So like most annoying story to work on, or best story I worked on, stuff like that. Like it can really be different formats, but it doesn't always have to be just a radically different format than your day-to-day. I think, as Fabian was saying, is like it can be something, just a theme, just a light skin on what you typically do. So for example, one that we had was like 90s boy bands. Which one is New Kids on the Block, and which one is the Backstreet Boys, and which one was 98 Degrees, or whichever one people don't like. But one thing they have to keep in mind about that, about the different themes, is that especially as we work in a globalized sort of environment, sometimes people don't always have those metaphors super accessible. So maybe my 90s boy band metaphor is a great example of that. It worked well in our team because several of us had that in our culture, but it might not work all of the time as you start working with other people who might not have those same sort of like cultural touchstones that you do.
Yeah, well, it's all about K-pop these days, right? So the Stan Nation,
exactly,
that sort of stuff. So whatever your team is sort of into musically, or sort of all those sorts of things. But I think you all touched on a great point, which is really you want to encourage folks to see things in a new light, right? And so what you want to do is challenge them to use their brains to articulate ideas in a way that they maybe haven't before. So again, one of my personal favorites, and it's in my talk if you want to watch it, is draw the sprint retro, right? Where you actually ask people to not use their words at all, right? You ask them to use pictures to articulate what's going on with them, what's going on with the team. And it really challenges them to use a side of their brain that they don't always use if they're used to sort of doing stuff. And I am a big, and I do not like start, stop, continue. So I always like revolt against those. I'm always like, can we try different formats? But that's the idea, is just to keep folks, keep it fresh, keep it interesting, mix up different formats. Terrific. Well, let's talk a little bit about some tooling. Now, again, stickies and a whiteboard are all you really need. So if you got that and you want to use those tools, 100% fine. But I'm kind of curious, and again, we talked about that not really scaling necessarily in a remote first world in particular. So we'll kind of go around the horn. It's an all play question on this one. And we'll start with you, Bruno, on this. What kind of tools are you and your team using to use retro? Share with us your best of breed techniques and tools right now.
Yeah, so we're a little on the boring end of the tooling spectrum. We use a website called stickies.io, which essentially tries to mimic the whiteboard. Some teams will use Microsoft, actually Google Sheets, just to represent their, with columns, what's working, what's not, depending on the format that they're using. And then we typically, if we're doing a large team retrospective, we do convert the top most upvoted questions or topics to present to a deck, and then walk through with people, or split it up into small groups for discussion and for next steps. So I don't have any very revealing tools, but I find that because we've been a distributed team for a while, and even more so now, just having a representation of the whiteboard in a async format is a huge improvement to what we used to do before, because as everyone mentioned here, as things come up, you write them, and then as you go to write, you see other people and you can upvote those other people's, and you can upvote theirs. So it's sort of a continuous retrospective with something at the end that allows you to actually combine it all, discuss it all, and come up with the next steps. So we stick to relatively boring tools, but it works.
Boring gets the job done, right? Your old Hyundai gets you to the store just as much as the Lamborghini, right? We do not need a massive overstuffed tool to necessarily get our job done. So that's terrific. That works for your team. Nick, how about you? What are your team using?
I'm very much in the same camp. I stick with the boring stuff. In some ways, I kind of think that having to muddle along through with a tool that isn't quite designed for what you're trying to do with it can sometimes be more fun than using some overcomplicated thing that the team doesn't know how to use. So actually, practically right now, we typically use, there's a thing in Azure DevOps, which for those of you who don't know is the Microsoft branded GitHub that is also owned by, it's confusing. Anyway, there's a thing in there for retrospectives, which is what we use day to day. But at previous gigs, I have even resorted to using Google Drawings with like rectangles to be used as stickies and circles to be used as dot voting. And that worked just fine.
Great. Fabian, how about you?
Also very similar. Say we in 9 out of 10 retros, I think we use mirror.com. So yet another whiteboard digital one. We have used Mentimeter, which is a nice tool for doing like audience polling and audience engagement questions. And that was quite fun to use as well.
Yeah.
As
And last one. Great. And Ceci, what does your team use?
I'm a big fan of Jamboard, but unfortunately it's only available if you use, it's a Google product. So one of the great things about it is that it integrates right into your Google Meet. So you can just fire off a Jamboard right from there. I'm also a big fan of Fellow, which is something that we use a lot here at Shopify, and it also integrates with Google Meet so that you can create a Fellow for each meeting that you have. And what's great about that tool is that every time that you have a meeting, a Fellow will take care of starting a new note for you. And it also has a little Chrome extension where you can access the notes right from your browser. But another great thing that I really like about this tool is that right before your meeting, if it's integrated with Fellow, Fellow will ping you on Slack and say, do you want to add any talking points to this meeting? Which again, I find really helpful because I think everybody can use that reminder. So it was like an automated way of doing things that I had been doing manually at previous teams. And another tool that I absolutely love that is not necessarily for a retro, but I think if you want to have more of a social type of retro, I really wanted to give a shout out to this tool called Kumo Space. It is kind of like this map where you join and you can see your little camera as kind of like a person that you move across the map. And the app is aware of where you are in the map. So it facilitates you being able to go into your own group. So if you wanted to do an exercise where you are all together kind of in a huddle, you can all hear each other and then physically move through the map and go into a sort of like breakout session. And you can only hear those people. And I think it makes it it feels a lot more natural. It almost feels like being in a room together again, where you can move through the space and interact with people in that way. So I really wanted to give a shout out to Kumo Space for that. It's kumospace.com.
Great. And, we'll go ahead and if you're in the lead dev Slack, again, we're going to drop off some links and blog posts and a whole bunch of stuff in there. So if we have any material we share today and you want a copy, hit us up in the Slack instance. I'm same with you all. I think you need just enough tool to get the job done. So I am not above using a Google spreadsheet. I am not above, or even a live Google Doc to have people sort of share stuff. Some of the more Chrome plated things I've used, Retrium's been pretty good. I like Retrium a lot. I love clustering. I love the active clustering. I think is incredibly powerful. And I think Retrium does that and dot voting quite elegantly. And it kind of gives you an on Rails experience. So it kind of guides you through sort of put your cards in, cluster them. It keeps things anonymous. So I had good experiences with that. We're also looking at Moreau as a possible solution as well. So a lot of great tools out there. So again, if you want to share that in the Slack instance with us as well, always looking for tips. So if you've got a great tool you want to share with us, hit us up there, hit us up on our Twitter handles. My DMs are open. Now let's move on a little bit and talk about, it's not just about the tools, right? It's really about how you run the retro itself. And I'd argue that facilitation is the most important tool you have. Like a good facilitator is one of your most important weapons going into a great retro. And there's a little bit of science and a whole lot of art, honestly, to doing this art of being an active facilitator, right? And really getting the most out of the group, creating that space. You want to have a safe space so that the really meaty stuff can surface. And so it's a lot of responsibility on the facilitator. This is going to be one for Nick and then Fabian. What are some pro tips you have out there for people who need to facilitate a retro? How do you handle tension within the retro, for example? How do you handle your participants not being engaged? So we'll start with you, Nick, and then we'll go to you, Fabian.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, though, which is the starting point for learning how to be a good facilitator is to recognize what your job is. And your job is to get the most out of the other people. It's not to be the source of answers. It's not to be the smart one. It's to be the person who's like prompting and poking and nudging and generally, as you say, creating the space where other people can share what they know so that the whole team can learn from that. I don't think we have time to get into like all of the tips and tricks and techniques, but I think probably the one thing that I make sure to tell people when I'm trying to help them learn how to be a better facilitator is to recognize that it's not actually as much about what you do as about how you do it and the energy you bring to doing it. The single most important thing you can do as a facilitator is to bring energy to the room, directed to whatever it is your purpose is in that particular moment, whether it's finding out what happened in the last sprint, whether it's learning about what went on during an incident, which is the kind of stuff I do a lot. And that energy will be reflected back to you by the participants. And if you don't have the energy, then your techniques and your tricks and your questions they're just going to fall flat and they're not going to go anywhere. Whereas the reverse is not necessarily true. If you have the energy and the team come along with you, then you can model your way through most things.
Great, wonderful.
You asked one specific thing, which was about handling tension in a retrospective. And very briefly, this is another thing that Lara Hogan has spoken about, which I absolutely love, is sometimes the best thing you can do as a facilitator to deal with tension in a room, if the conversation's going off the rails, is name the problem. Just say, hey, folks, I feel like we're talking past one another here, or I think the energy in the room has changed. Let's talk about why that is. And just that simple act can sometimes reset things and get people back into a collaborative mode. So that's a power tool that I learned from Lara.
Wonderful. And how about you, Fabian? What are a couple of top pro tips you have for our facilitators out there?
Yeah, first off, heavy +1 to what Nick said. The energy is really what drives a lot of this. We also touched on other topics before, like leveling the playing field or creating a safe space. And there are techniques that are especially suited for that, I think. Say, for example, I like the fishbowl format where you have on stage, be it virtual or physical, 3 open seats, and only 2 at a time may have persons on it. So you prompt the audience, some audience members get up, take a seat and discuss the matter. And if a 3rd person joins, another one has to leave. And that way you introduce the constraints that Nick talked earlier about. You regulate the conversation flow and you somehow tame maybe the more dominant speakers in the room. You can get even more extreme with that. Say we've run silent retros. In this particular one, every participant got a blank sheet of paper. They were asked to write one statement, one observation about the last sprint at the top, and then pass it on to the next person. And the next person, the neighbor, was asked to add to it, starting their own sentence with yes and da da da, and then off to the next and off to the next. Eventually, the paper came back to the original author, and they had like a super rich, super detailed exploration of the matter they started with, and it allowed us to then generate ideas and action items to continue without speaking a single word, which is great to like include the more quiet folks on your team.
I love that. I love that. As a former improv person, I love the yes and. So that's great. That's another one for the old toolkit. I've never heard of that, but I love that concept. Well, we're getting close here to the end. So let's talk a little bit about, it's not just about the retro itself, right? But there's the pre and post part of retro. So I want to touch on that real quick. And Bruno, we're going to start with you here. When you think about what prerequisites need to be in place before you can even go to the retro, because you want to make sure your retro is going to be set up for success. The team is prepared for what the retro is going to sort of uncover. What do you want to be in place there before you kick off with the team?
Yeah, I think it varies quite a bit depending on the type of retro that you are running, but we tend to run retros focused on particular topics. There are certainly sprint-based retros that happen at the end of sprints, and I won't touch on those, but the ones that I find more interesting is when we have a particular set of topics or a particular, not necessarily topics, but an area that we want to discuss, whether it's on the people side, whether it's on the project side, whether it's on changing scope or whatever it may be. So we like to start with a particular focus in mind, and of course all the prerequisites of a good retro, which is understanding that we've all tried our best and the whole nine, right? Understanding that we're not in there to point fingers, that we're not in there to just complain, right? We're trying to solve and address. So those are sort of the table stakes of retrospective, but we'd like to focus on having particular focuses, making sure the focus is clear, making sure the format's clear, giving people time and space to think about what they want to bring to the table in an async manner, so that they have time to process and they have a clear grasp on what is it that they want to bring, giving time for folks to upvote, others understand, and then also do a lot of clustering grouping of what we want to discuss to try to distill it down to the most important topics. So I know it's kind of just more pragmatic than maybe you were looking for, but it's having that focus. It's about having done some work ahead of time to prepare so that we can get a focused amount of time, because you're only going to have so much time and so much attention from folks, right? So that's what we tend to focus on.
Well, it takes a lot of work to make it look easy. Nick, you had mentioned you want to touch on this one briefly as well. Did you want to share anything in terms of the preconditions for retros?
Yeah, I think probably only to say a retro is not always the solution to your problems. And for me, like, I think of like the preconditions to a retro in the broadest possible terms as being trust and pressure. And the higher the pressure on the team, the higher the trust levels need to be for a retro to be an effective tool in your toolbox. So if you're not a particularly experienced facilitator, if the team's under a lot of pressure and the trust environment isn't necessarily there, maybe don't use a retrospective, because if it goes wrong, it can be really traumatic for the people who are involved. So better not get into that situation in the first place. Yeah,
100% agree. I'm a big fan of the power of coaching and people who are really experienced in helping teams navigate team health things. A lot of the Pat Lencioni school of thought is really, really fascinating that way. And it's definitely a precondition before you get into the mechanics of retros. Let's talk about the flip side very quickly. And Ceci, I'll toss to you on this one. What needs to happen after the retro is done? Or when you look back, how do you know that you've done a good job? What are the closeout activities you do around retros?
For me, it's mostly looking at whether it's mostly thinking about, was this effective? Was this an effective use of time? And one of the things that we look for is, did people attend the meeting? I think a big smell that the retrospective might not be working is if a lot of people end up skipping it regularly. We've had issues in the past where several key people just kept on not being able to attend the retro. And I feel like that's a big smell that there's something happening. Either people in your team are too busy to attend, which is something that you need to look at, or maybe the time is just not being utilized very effectively. So I think that those are things that I look for after the retro to see if it was effective. And then also, is your retro constantly running out of time? And the solution there obviously is not to make it longer. The solution really might be just might vary from team to team. It might be that it's running out of time for various different reasons, and getting to the crux of why that's happening. So I would say if the retros are constantly running out of time, that's another big smell that I would look for. But other than that, if people are attending and we're ending on time and there was a productive conversation, those are the things that I look for to see that it was a success.
All right, awesome. Well, and speaking of running out of time, you kind of set me up for this final wrap up here. We are sort of at the end of our panel session. Let me take a quick look at the Q&A capsule to see if anybody has any questions. Looks like there's a link, request for a link to the audio tool that Fabian mentioned. So again, we'll go ahead and post in the Slack channel in Lead Dev Slack, hashtag retros. If you want to ask us questions, if you're watching this on recording, we'll still be hanging out in that Slack. So go ahead and hit us up. Thank you all so much for your amazing insights in today's panel. I feel like I learned a lot from you all. I thought this was a really terrific conversation. I hope you all out there watching were able to take away some great tips to help level up your retros and your understanding of retros. Thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you on a future Lead Dev webinar. Thank you all for attending.